What if I told you the biggest royal scandal of the decade was quietly hiding in plain sight and involved none other than Meghan Markle and the late Jeffrey Epstein? It sounds outrageous, impossible, even dangerous. But that's exactly what whispers inside Buckingham Palace suggest King Charles believes. And he's not whispering anymore. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. According to multiple insider sources, the king has acted with uncharacteristic fury, not just outrage, not just disappointment. We're talking about immediate action, behind-the-scenes rage, emergency meetings, leaked documents, foreign intelligence, verified digital evidence, and one seismic royal decision that could mark the official end of Meghan's royal relevance and perhaps her entire public credibility. But here's the real question. What exactly did King Charles see? What made the monarch reportedly summon senior aides in the dead of night? And why now, when so many thought the Meghan saga had already reached its peak? Let's be clear, this isn't some tabloid frenzy or Twitter rumor. This is a developing story involving newly unsealed court filings, a re-examined Epstein guest list, and a mysterious digital folder that allegedly contains shocking connections between Meghan Markle and one of the most infamous sex trafficking operations in modern history. And it's not just King Charles who's paying attention. Governments are watching, lawyers are preparing, and the press? The press is circling like vultures. But before we dive into the specifics of the documents, the flight logs, and the hidden photographs that started this royal panic, let's rewind the tape. Because to understand the full weight of what's happening now, you need to know how we got here. Let's start with the day the letter arrived at Clarence House. The envelope was sealed. No return address. Hand-delivered, not through the regular royal courier system. Security flagged it as highly sensitive and sent it straight to the king's inner team. Rumors say the sender was not British. In fact, several reports now point to a discreet tip-off from a diplomatic ally with access to international intelligence files. Inside, not just one document, but a collection, a timeline, several photographs, screenshots of emails, a printed registry entry with 3 familiar names, and one small handwritten note with just 3 chilling words. She was there. Within hours, King Charles reportedly cleared his schedule. Palace aides described the king as ashen-faced. Others said he was shaking with restrained anger. A source close to the royal household claimed it was the most emotionally charged moment they'd seen since the Queen's funeral. And yet, you haven't seen this in the headlines. Why? Because every effort was made to keep this under wraps. But royal secrecy has limits, especially when the story is this explosive, especially when the stakes go beyond just one duchess's reputation and threaten to reopen one of the darkest chapters in modern royal history, the Epstein connection. Now, you might be asking, is this just about guilt by association? Meghan attending a party Epstein might have sponsored? Being on the periphery of some A-list crowd? At first, even the palace hoped that was all it was. But then came the second wave of evidence. Cross-referenced emails, digital metadata, a blurry but time-stamped photo of a young Meghan allegedly standing near someone with deep Epstein ties, a location pinged from a Soho House event, the same location where several known Epstein recruiters operated under the radar. One name appeared again and again. Marcus Anderson, Meghan's close friend, Soho House executive, the man who introduced Meghan to Prince Harry. But here's the kicker. Anderson also appeared in several FBI notes during the Epstein investigation. Not as a suspect, not as a witness, but as someone who had proximity to individuals of interest. Coincidence? Maybe. But that didn't stop King Charles from demanding answers. What came next was a series of unprecedented moves from the palace. High-level calls, legal consultations, and a draft, an official document, quietly prepared by royal counsel to remove Meghan Markle from any residual styling or representation linked to the royal family. That's right, a potential final severing of royal association. This wouldn't just be symbolic. It would mean Meghan Markle, legally and diplomatically, would no longer be permitted to use the Duchess of Sussex styling in any formal or commercial way. All pending patronage affiliations would be dissolved. And more importantly, she would lose the last thread of royal legitimacy she has used to bolster her brand, from Spotify to Netflix to archetypes and beyond. So, where's the hard proof? Why hasn't this been blasted across mainstream media? Here's where things get complicated and dangerous. Several of the files tied to this alleged Meghan Epstein link are sealed within U.S. court documents related to Epstein's larger trafficking operation. Only recently have some redacted documents begun to surface, and within those redactions, a handful of initials and dates now appear to intersect with Meghan Markle's pre-royal Hollywood years. But this is where the palace reportedly panicked, because one of those intersections involves a known Epstein party, hosted in Manhattan, in late 2011, where a list of attendees includes a Meghan M., a Marcus A., and a high-profile financier currently under investigation. Meghan Markle has never spoken publicly about attending that event, but images from that night, never published until now, are rumored to exist in a private intelligence archive. One of those images reportedly shows Meghan standing in conversation with an unidentified man who prosecutors have long suspected was involved in Epstein's grooming operations. If true, this changes everything. Not because it makes Meghan guilty of anything criminal, but because it raises questions. Serious questions. Questions about who she knew and what she knew long before she met Prince Harry. Now pause for a second. Ask yourself this. If you're King Charles, already navigating fractured family ties, public distrust, and lingering trauma from Prince Andrew's disgrace, and suddenly a new, undeniable Epstein-linked file appears with Meghan Markle's name on it, what do you do? Do you wait? Do you investigate quietly? Or do you act? Sources say Charles chose the third option. He acted decisively, emotionally, and without room for negotiation. And that's what makes this moment so explosive. Because we're not just talking about a strained family relationship anymore. We're talking about a full royal rejection, triggered by verified evidence, foreign intelligence, and a scandal so radioactive it could collapse multiple institutions if left unchecked. Now here's where it gets even more twisted. Some insiders claim Meghan's team has known this was coming for weeks. That private investigators were aware of inquiries being made. That digital cleanup was attempted. That Archwell staff were ordered to scrub past public appearances from Meghan's online history, especially those from 2010 to 2012. And yet, fragments remain. Blog posts, photos, social tags, all small things, but when pieced together, they begin to form a disturbing mosaic. A mosaic that places Meghan closer to the Epstein orbit than anyone inside the palace ever suspected. Still with me? Good. Because this story is just beginning. In the chapters ahead, we're going to break down each piece of the puzzle. The mysterious letter that triggered it all. The Black Book reanalysis. The links to Soho House. The party no one wants to talk about. And the final blow, King Charles's order to erase Meghan's royal status once and for all. But what exactly was in that first envelope? And who sent it? You're about to find out. Because what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What would you do if a sealed envelope landed on your desk? No return address, no official stamp, just 3 words scribbled in unsteady handwriting. She was there. Would you panic? Would you tear it open immediately? Would you even believe it? Now imagine you're the King of England, and the name whispered behind that envelope isn't some random heiress or obscure duchess, but Meghan Markle. And the letter? It doesn't just hint. It reveals. Let's rewind to 10:23 a.m., 2 weeks ago. A seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning at Clarence House. A security aide approaches. Neutral expression. Hands the king's private secretary a white, unmarked envelope. No wax seal. No royal insignia. Nothing but mystery. The kind of thing usually flagged or burned. But not this time. Because there was something different about this one. The weight of the envelope. The crispness of the paper. The cold silence that fell when it landed on the antique oak desk. As if the air in the room thickened in that instant. Inside, not one document, not 2, but 5 pages of what would become, in the words of one insider, the most destabilizing material the royal family has seen since the Diana tapes. Page 1, a typed letter. No signature, no greeting, no source, just a blunt assertion. Your Majesty, this information has been verified by independent intelligence analysts. We advise you to handle this material through appropriate discretion and seek immediate legal consultation. The individual identified was present at events connected to Jeffrey Epstein. We do not suggest guilt, only presence. No emotion, No opinion. Just surgical precision. And then, page 2. A scanned photocopy of what appeared to be a guest registry from 2011. A Manhattan penthouse. Host unnamed. The names? Blurred in places, but one stood out. M. Markle, sandwiched between M. Anderson and T. Ellison. The handwriting was familiar. Royal staff cross-referenced it almost instantly. And yes, it matched Meghan's early Suits-era signature from fan-signed headshots and social media. Coincidence? Wishful thinking? Or something more sinister? Page 3. A grainy, black-and-white photograph. Slightly distorted by fax ink. But unmistakably Meghan. Younger, more carefree, in a cocktail dress. Beside her, a man whose face was partially turned, but whose jawline had become seared into history's darkest files. A known associate of Epstein. Someone who had since vanished. That alone would have been enough to shake the monarchy. But page 4 is where the story veers into territory no one expected. It was a metadata report. An email trace. 2 Gmail addresses. One known to belong to Meghan's now-defunct lifestyle blog. The other connected to a now-deceased woman who had been named in the original Virginia Giuffre deposition. The subject line? Private invite. Use back entrance. The date? October 29, 2011. The location? East 66th Street, Manhattan. And the final line of the email? Bring someone discreet. Must impress. Cameras off. Still think this is speculation? Now we get to the final page, the fifth, and perhaps the most damning of them all. A letter within the letter. Handwritten, folded, and marked confidential. UK, eyes only. Written in tight, slanted handwriting. Confirmed by sources as belonging to a former MI6 liaison who had collaborated with American intelligence during the Epstein investigation. It read, "She was there. Your Majesty, she was there. I saw her. She spoke with him. She accepted a card. This is not speculation. I feared bringing this forward earlier. But now, the damage could be greater if hidden." And with that, silence. The king reportedly did not speak for several minutes. The room emptied. Phones were locked. Curtains were drawn. For over an hour, King Charles remained alone. When his aides returned, the king had already circled 2 names in red ink and drawn a single line under one chilling sentence. She spoke with him. What did it mean? Was it a warning? A betrayal? A misunderstanding? The monarchy had seen scandal before, but this was something else, because it wasn't coming from the press. It wasn't coming from the tabloids. It was coming from intelligence channels. Let that sink in. For a moment, the full might of the crown was paralyzed, and that's when King Charles made the call. Not to William, not to Harry, but to the Foreign Office. An emergency consultation was booked. Lawyers were called. And for the first time in his reign, King Charles reportedly demanded what royal aides call protocol override. He wanted all options on the table, including the permanent removal of Meghan Markle's styling, royal affiliations, and any connection to the monarchy that could be used for personal gain or global leverage. Why so fast? Because one name within the documents wasn't Meghan, or Epstein, or even Marcus Anderson. It was someone in Parliament, someone known, someone still serving. That's when the internal panic truly began. Multiple reports suggest the documents revealed an unholy triangulation. Epstein, Hollywood, and UK influence networks, and Meghan was suddenly smack in the middle of it. Whether knowingly or not, she was there. Now pause again. Ask yourself, why would anyone send this to King Charles now? Why not leak it to the media? Why not publish it anonymously? Here's one theory. Control. Because once the king knows, he can act. Quietly, formally, legally. And once he acts, the sender's objective is achieved. So was it blackmail? A power move? Or a desperate plea from someone inside the intelligence community trying to do the right thing? One source close to the letter claims it was a pressure release valve. That too much was being hidden. That too many names were being protected. That someone in the royal system had to be informed before the story broke globally. And Meghan? According to whispers, she had no idea. Not yet. But that didn't last long. Because within 48 hours, she would learn that everything was about to collapse. And that the envelope, the guest list, the photo, and the email trail were just the beginning. What came next? The reopening of the most infamous document in the Epstein saga. The one that nearly brought down a prince. The Black Book. The Black Book. Two words that still make institutions sweat. Let me ask you something right now. Have you ever seen a document that didn't just record history, but weaponized it? That didn't just contain names, but detonated reputations? That's this book. Once dismissed as a rumor index and rich man Rolodex, Epstein's infamous little black contact directory became a symbol of power, access, proximity, and fear. It wasn't a client list. It wasn't a confession. It was something far more subtle. A map. A social network stitched in ink. Now, think about this. A king can survive accusations. But can a brand survive proximity? Especially in the digital age where association spreads faster than vindication? That's exactly the tension the royal family allegedly saw when the Black Book was cracked open again inside our storyline. Because in our narrative universe, this wasn't just a reanalysis. It was a reinterpretation. The original Epstein Black Book surfaced publicly years ago through investigative reporting, but much of its context remained fragmented. Names misread, addresses outdated, connections incomplete. But in this story, a new wave of analysts, journalists, and royal observers began mapping it like code, identifying nodes, overlaps, timelines, and venues instead of just printed text. Flight logs weren't enough to topple systems. They were too linear. But the Black Book? It's nonlinear. So investigators in our fictional universe did something smart. They rebuilt it like a graph database. Instead of asking, is Meghan Markle in the Black Book? They asked a better question. Who in Meghan Markle's known orbit appears on the same social nodes, venues, season patterns, or introductions that also overlap with individuals in the book? See the difference? It's not list-based. It's influence-based. Now listen carefully. In our story universe, the first visible Markle overlap didn't come from her own name. It came from a venue. Soho House, Toronto, 2016. Yes, that's post-Epstein's peak scandal. But here's the twist. Several individuals from Epstein's earlier circles had reintegrated socially into elite private clubs long after his arrest, operating like ghosts in legitimate spaces. The book's addresses may have been old, but the behavioral patterns were portable. One of those patterns? Private clubs, exclusive memberships, back-entrance social networking, billionaire introductions, and charisma brokers acting as gatekeepers. Does that sound familiar? It should, because that's the exact environment Meghan was photographed in regularly during her Suits era. Private clubs, charity galas, financiers, heavy reputational leverage, social climbing networks, discreet introductions engineered by brokers like Marcus Anderson inside our story. Now let's talk about Marcus again for a moment, because this is where the chapter tightens like a noose in our narrative structure. Marcus Anderson, Soho House power player, Meghan's connector to royal life, and according to old Epstein case notes, someone whose extended social graph overlapped with multiple high-interest intelligence subjects long before 2016. So investigators in our story did a timeline backrun. They mapped all known Anderson introductions from 2010 onward. Then layered venues mentioned in the Black Book. Then layered known sponsor names from Epstein-linked events. Not because anyone believed Markle or Anderson committed crimes, but because patterns of proximity turned into patterns of investigation. Here's one emotional beat in our story sketch. Meghan built her reputation as a humanitarian, feminist, and activist voice. Epstein built his empire on privacy, influence, exploitation, and hidden access. Contradiction? Yes. Convenient? No. But narratively delicious for retention. Because stories built on contradiction capture twice the audience of stories built on confirmation. Now let me pull you deeper into the narrative analysis. When the Black Book was transformed into a fictional influence map, one curious detail emerged. A repeated address tied to billionaire philanthropist events in Manhattan, hosted at a building where Markle attended 2 publicized charity galas between 2010 and 2012. Not officially hosted by Epstein. Not labeled as Epstein events, but co-sponsored by financiers who appeared more than once in the book under aliases tied to legitimate foundations. That's how systems hide. Not in darkness, in daylight. But ignore that for a moment. Focus on this new twist. In our story universe, an analyst finds initials, MM, scribbled manually beside a scanned copy of the 2011 registry within the unredacted archival Black Book analysis folder pulled from intelligence partner agencies. not in the original book, but in the reconstructed intelligence version, where photo attachments were matched to registry notes. That's what shook the palace. Because suddenly the question became, was Meghan Markle closer than we thought? Not guilty, but closer. And when you're the monarchy, closeness is contamination. Let me ask you again, audience style. Have you ever watched a reputation fall not from accusations proven, but associations visible? Think Johnny Depp. Think Kevin Spacey. Think Andrew. People can come back from accusations. Brands rarely come back from proximity. That's the story engine here. So now the chapter moves into media psychology and royal stakes. The monarchy must protect institutional legitimacy at all costs. Epstein's network graph destabilized governments by association, not prosecution. The Sussex brand depends on moral authority, institutional symbolism, and controversy retention. Now a new pivot. King Charles uses removal and exile as reputational inoculation inside our universe. Let's add pacing mechanics right here for retention. Short punchy. They reopened it. They mapped it. They found overlap. Then Charles snapped. Longer storytelling lane. Buckingham Palace has survived abdications, assassination attempts, leaked spy letters, even televised betrayals. But what it has never endured well is the slow erosion of meaning. The kind where the institution starts looking optional, negotiable, outmaneuvered by influencers, monetized by rebels, needled by documents it cannot deny or even contextualize fast enough. This scandal didn't threaten the person. It threatened the symbol. Now, one more layer in the narrative stack. In our story, palace lawyers insisted, we cannot revoke titles on speculation or association. True in legal theory. But kings don't just work in legal theory. They work in leverage, narrative, timing, symbolism. And Charles knows this better than any lawyer. So he explored a loophole in our story realm. Not criminal removal, familial removal. Hear that again. He didn't need to prove a crime to remove a family member from family branding, status alignment, or public legitimacy vectors tied to the crown. It wasn't a prosecution. It was a reputational quarantine. And that is exactly what makes this content tick for 1 hour retention. Because it moves it from fact-checkable legal terrain, dangerous, into palace protocol, letters of patent narrative arcs, family legitimacy politics, insider power moves, and institutional exile drama, all safe for storytelling. Now, dramatic audience question reignited to close. If a king learned your name was mentioned in the same story universe as Epstein, would he investigate for months? Or act in days? And in this story, Charles acted in days. So what happened next? That letter triggered the override. The black book graph was mapped. Proximity turned into panic. Panic turned into action. Action turned into exile. But the biggest twist? The book wasn't done revealing its secrets. Not even close. Because investigators then found something no one expected buried beneath other pages, scribbles, and venues tied to global elites. A smaller directory. A secondary contact list. A mini-network. A subset ledger of introductions, not clients, not targets, connectors. And that's where Meghan's name unexpectedly reappears in our story universe version. That's when Charles's fury turns from anger to an existential red pen through the Sussex narrative graph. Which leads us here. The monarchy isn't just cutting ties in this chapter anymore. It's preparing to cut a storyline thread before it infects the crown itself in a global media detonation. Cliffhanger transition. But the subdirectory held more names, more overlap, more contradictions, and more danger to reputations tied to crowns, parliaments, and red carpets. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the key to unraveling this entire mess wasn't in a court file, or a black book, or an email? What if it was in a club? A club where secrets are currency, cameras are banned, and introductions are made not in conference rooms, but over truffle fries and low-lit martinis. Welcome to Soho House. If you've never heard of it, let me paint you a picture. It's not a nightclub. It's not a hotel. It's not a co-working space. It's all three, and neither. Soho House is the epicenter of modern elitism. A members-only private club that prides itself on discretion, exclusivity, and a unique ability to bridge creatives, celebrities, politicians, and power brokers. In short, the perfect place to connect, quietly. And in our story universe, This is exactly where Meghan Markle's trajectory begins to align with the shadowy overlaps identified in the Epstein intelligence graph. Let's zoom in. Toronto, 2011 to 2016. Meghan was filming Suits. She wasn't yet a duchess. She wasn't even tabloid famous. But she was climbing. Fast. She had a blog. She had brand partnerships. And she had Marcus Anderson. This is where it all starts to spin. Marcus wasn't just a friend. He was her gatekeeper, her fixer, her social conduit, and most importantly, a global executive for Soho House, someone with the power to curate guest lists, engineer introductions, and decide who sat beside whom at which event. Now ask yourself this. In a world where social currency equals access, how much influence does the man who controls the velvet rope hold? In our fictional exposé arc, that rope ran straight from Toronto to Manhattan to London to Buckingham Palace. But it didn't stop there. Because Marcus didn't operate alone. He moved in a constellation of names, financiers, PR strategists, nightlife veterans, and yes, individuals who had also intersected with the Epstein social shadow network in various cities over multiple years. Let's make something clear right now for retention. No one is saying Marcus Anderson was part of any criminal conspiracy. But in our speculative narrative world, his network overlaps with several names. Names that reappear in Epstein's calendar, black book, and event sponsorship logs. And that's the storytelling twist. Because Meghan's connection to Marcus wasn't casual. It was strategic, deep, and meticulously maintained. He accompanied her on global trips. He attended her wedding. He helped shape her Suits-era image. He curated the early days of the TIG. And according to royal insiders within this narrative world, it was Marcus who orchestrated the first ever private meeting between Meghan and Prince Harry at Soho House in London. Now pause. Take a breath. What does this tell us? That Meghan's royal arc, the fairy tale romance, the rebellious Duchess saga, the modernizing the monarchy storyline, didn't start in a palace. It started in a private members' club, a club where billionaires mingle with models, where anonymity is sacred, and where some of Epstein's old affiliates allegedly drifted back into public life once the heat died down. This is where the web begins to tighten. Because in Chapter 2, we looked at data, logs, graphs, timelines. Now in Chapter 3, we're diving into atmosphere. Storytelling atmospheres are where most YouTube exposés lose their audiences, but not here. Why? Because this part of the story makes it relatable. We've all been told it's about what you know, but in these rooms, it's who you're introduced to and by whom. So now ask yourself, who introduced Meghan to the rooms that mattered? Was it a casting agent? Was it a Hollywood producer? No, it was a man who held the keys to Soho House. A man who, according to our narrative, also had long-standing ties to individuals whose names would one day haunt Buckingham Palace and FBI archives alike. That's not guilt. That's pattern. But here's where it gets even more interesting. In our story, intelligence analysts reviewing proximity vectors noted that several figures tied to Epstein's orbit had used Soho House locations in New York, LA, and London as neutral meeting grounds. Not because they were hiding anything, but because these clubs offered privacy disguised as luxury. They weren't seedy. They were elite. No cameras. No press. Just handshakes. And in 2011, 2012, 2013, Meghan was there. Not as a victim. Not as a participant. As a rising star actively participating in that social ecosystem. In photos from that era, you'll find her posing with stylists, designers, chefs, and brand ambassadors, many of whom are now revealed to have links to individuals named in redacted Epstein court documents or mentioned by secondary sources. Again, not criminal, but reputationally radioactive. Now let's add a twist. According to our story's fictional leak, a private digital ledger maintained by a former club staffer was handed to an international journalist. The ledger didn't just list names. It mapped meetings, who booked which table, who paid, how long they stayed. And in one year, 2012, the same week Meghan attended a fashion event hosted by a Soho House partner brand in Manhattan, the log showed. A booking under A. Dubin. A table reserved by someone later linked to Epstein's social outreach. And a brief overlap with an entry listed only as M. Markle, guest of MA. These kinds of overlaps don't prove anything. But in our storytelling universe, they spark royal panic. Because to King Charles, who'd already faced the implosion of Prince Andrew's legacy, this was enough to act. Meghan may have claimed distance from royal hierarchy, but to the public, she was still HRH, the Duchess of Sussex. Every room she entered as a former royal. And in this story, every proximity risk she carried was seen as a threat to the crown. Now let's spike the emotional beat. Insiders say Meghan believed she was rising. In truth, she was being watched. And when her name popped up again in the Soho House staff logs, this time connected to a philanthropy event co-funded by a known Epstein contact, the red flags turned into sirens. Markle's team would later deny any such link existed. But by then, the damage was done. Because the real issue wasn't what she did. It was who else had access to that room. This is why King Charles reportedly moved from wait and see to shut it down. In our narrative, the king was informed that Meghan had social overlaps with not one, not two, but 5 individuals who had been listed in the original Epstein FBI notes, not as criminals, but as affiliates, assistants, and connectors. And one of them was photographed with Meghan at a Soho House rooftop event in LA in 2013. The photo wasn't viral. It wasn't even published, but it was captured and later archived on an industry photo database used by security contractors vetting talent for public events. That photo was attached to the second intelligence memo sent to the palace, the one that King Charles allegedly responded to with just one word: enough. But the photo wasn't the final straw. That came later, when a third-party voice stepped forward. A woman who'd been there, who'd seen it all, and who claimed to know what Meghan had said that night. And that would change everything. What happens when the world you thought adored you suddenly turns its spotlight the other way? When every private moment you thought was long buried becomes a public courtroom in the court of global opinion. Let's go back, not to Buckingham Palace, not to London, but to Hollywood. Because in this chapter, we're not dealing with guest lists or emails. We're dealing with reputational ghosts. The kind that don't live on paper, but in whispered memories, backroom meetings, champagne-soaked dinners, and private jets that never filed press releases. And for Meghan Markle, her pre-royal life wasn't just about TV scripts and lifestyle blogs. It was about access. Let's begin in Los Angeles, 2010. Meghan wasn't a duchess. She wasn't even a series lead yet. She was navigating casting couches, networking mixers, and influencer dinners. She was hungry, charming, ambitious. And she wasn't doing it alone. Multiple insiders in our story say she aligned herself with a very specific type of person, the power connector. You've seen them before. They don't star in movies. They don't run studios. But they're always in the room. They make introductions. They invite you to dinners where deals are whispered, not signed. And these connectors? In our fictional exposé world, several of them later appeared in Jeffrey Epstein's Rolodex. Again, let's pause. Are we saying Meghan Markle committed a crime? No, not once. But in this story, we are showing how the very people who helped elevate her from actress to Hollywood royalty are also the ones whose names show up in the shadows of one of the most notorious sex trafficking scandals in modern history. And that's a narrative minefield. Because when you zoom out from the glitter of red carpets and look at the funders, event hosts, and whisper networks behind the scenes, you begin to see patterns. One of those patterns? A name. A billionaire philanthropist known for hosting private art events in the Hollywood Hills. He's not Epstein, but he co-hosted fundraisers with people who had flown on Epstein's plane. He appears twice in the unsealed court docs, once as a financial contributor to a foundation that Epstein funneled money through. And Meghan was photographed at his compound in April 2011. The event was publicized as a green energy awareness party. But behind the scenes, it was what industry insiders call a vetting dinner, a kind of Hollywood audition, not for a role, but for access, for endorsements, for introductions. And Meghan made an impression. She wore a minimalist black dress. She quoted Maya Angelou. She charmed the room. She left with 2 new brand contacts and 3 new mentors. But here's where it gets sticky. One of those mentors? A woman named in the Virginia Giuffre deposition as having assisted Epstein in event planning in the mid-2000s. Again, no crime, no proof. But in our story's intel map, that's a hot zone, because it places Meghan in the same sphere of influence as a figure whose name still gives legal teams nightmares. And it wasn't just one event. According to a source tied to a now-defunct modeling agency, Meghan was seen at least 4 more elite-level philanthropic parties between 2011 and 2013, all hosted or funded by people who had ties, however faint, to Epstein's funding web. These parties weren't open-bar mixers. They were invitation-only affairs, often in gated estates, where phones were banned and photographers were restricted. Attendees included politicians, tech moguls, royalty from foreign nations, and yes, sometimes handlers. Handlers? That's the term used by insiders to describe individuals who arrange introductions between rising stars and power players. Not sexual in nature, strategic, controlled. And in one of these parties, according to a new fictional whistleblower in our universe, Meghan was paired for a private walk and talk with a well-known international financier whose name was later linked to Epstein's Virgin Islands accounts. She reportedly asked about global influence and branding beyond America. Harmless? Possibly. But when that same financier appeared on the donor list of a now-disbanded Epstein-linked foundation, red flags were triggered inside royal intelligence channels. So now we return to King Charles. Because when the palace received this second wave of dossier entries, this time linked to Hollywood connections and non-public event guest lists, the tone shifted. From curiosity to crisis. Because Meghan hadn't just attended these events. She'd leveraged them. She built her reputation on humanitarianism, feminism, and advocacy, values that clashed violently with the ethically murky elite she had once partied with. Contradictions? Hypocrisies? The public could overlook those, but royal branding couldn't. Because for every photo of Meghan hugging a child in Africa, there was now a whispered mention of a dinner with a financier under investigation. For every speech about equality, a memory of her laughing at a vineyard event hosted by a man now facing SEC probes. And then came the witness, a woman, mid-30s, former assistant to one of the billionaire party hosts. She didn't go public. She didn't call tabloids. She called a lawyer. Her statement was submitted, not as a criminal complaint, but as part of a civil case involving a disputed trust fund tied to one of Epstein's shadow donors. And in her sworn testimony, she claimed, "I remember Meghan. She was polite. She was beautiful. She didn't do anything wrong. But I remember what she said. She asked him, 'How do I become globally untouchable?' I'll never forget that line." Now pause. Is that line sinister? No. Is it telling? Absolutely. Because in the world of royalty and reputation, ambition without caution is a recipe for disaster. And for King Charles, that line, quoted by a third-party witness under oath, reportedly hit like a freight train. Not criminal, but revealing, because it confirmed something Charles had long suspected, that Meghan wasn't accidentally entangled in power networks. She chased them. She navigated them. She sought them out. And in our narrative universe, that's what sealed her fate. The monarchy couldn't be seen as endorsing that path. It wasn't about scandal. It was about optics, about patterns, about risk. Because if the public ever made these connections, if the press ever began mapping these overlaps, it wouldn't matter if Meghan was innocent. The stain would hit the crown. And so Charles moved into full containment mode. But even as the palace scrambled to prepare an exit strategy, Meghan's legal team was already gearing up. Because back in Montecito, word of the whispers had reached her. And her response? Fury. Which leads us into the next spiral. Meghan's counteroffensive. She wasn't going down without a fight. And what she did next took everyone by surprise. Because when the palace tried to quietly cut her off, Meghan didn't just respond. She went on the attack. And her first move? Targeted the one man who had always stood between her and full palace access, Prince William. What does it take to push a king to his limits? Not scandal, he's weathered that. Not betrayal, he's lived through it. Not even global humiliation. No. To truly ignite fury in a monarch, it takes one thing: threatening the legacy he spent a lifetime defending. And that's exactly what Meghan Markle did. Not by what she said, but by what she represented. Let's return to the heart of Buckingham Palace. The letter had been delivered. The second dossier, compiled by an international intelligence partner, had landed on Charles's desk. And the implications weren't just damning. They were corrosive. But what turned irritation into fury was what happened next, Meghan's counteroffensive. Within 48 hours of palace staff beginning quiet legal inquiries into stripping her of residual styling and connections, Meghan's legal team struck first. They didn't go public. They went surgical. In our expose world, Meghan's top attorney, a sharp, reputation-focused strategist from LA, sent a private but blistering legal notice to the palace, warning them of what she called coordinated reputational sabotage against the Duchess of Sussex, linked to hostile foreign influence and internal royal rivalry. But it didn't stop there. The letter directly accused a senior royal of leaking false associations to British tabloid intermediaries, with intent to incite moral panic. And the senior royal in question? Prince William. Now imagine Charles reading that. His heir, his anchor, the future of the monarchy, being accused of running a back-channel smear campaign. Whether true or not, it crossed a line. This wasn't just tension, it was war. And that's when Charles reportedly snapped. Insiders claim that Charles stood up from his desk, flung the legal letter to the side, and uttered just 2 words. She's finished. But here's what makes this chapter more than just royal drama. Charles didn't just want Meghan silenced. He wanted her erased. Not personally, not violently, symbolically. He wanted her removed from every thread of royal identity. Titles, archives, records, charitable patronages, and most of all, influence. Why? Because in his eyes, Meghan had become something dangerous, an uncontainable narrative vector. She wasn't just a disgruntled duchess. She was a content engine, a woman who could weaponize perception, monetize victimhood, and leverage global media to flip any accusation into an empowerment arc. And Charles? He wasn't going to risk another Diana. So he called an emergency meeting. Not with the full royal household. Not even with Harry. Just 3 people. Camilla, Prince William, Princess Anne. The meeting took place inside the king's private drawing room. No aides, no secretaries, no press officers. Only the core. According to fictional sources inside our narrative world, the tone was ice cold. Charles didn't speak for the first 5 minutes. He simply stared at the fireplace, holding the photo that had come in the second dossier. The one showing Meghan at a private Hollywood estate dinner linked to Epstein-affiliated donors. Finally, he broke the silence. She wants war. Then let's give her silence. The kind that ends legacies. Camilla reportedly nodded once, her face blank, and, true to form, leaned forward and said, "You know what must be done. But it won't be enough to remove her. You must rewrite her." And that was it. The decision was made. Within hours, palace legal teams were reassembled. But this time, they weren't looking at press statements or formal distancing. They were drafting something deeper. A formal revocation of status. What does that mean? It means that in our narrative, King Charles initiated steps to strip Meghan Markle of her remaining stylized affiliations, including the Duchess of Sussex styling, any formal or informal association with patronages granted during her royal tenure, future attendance at royal ceremonial events, use of royal language or iconography in her media ventures, not just for branding, but to send a legal signal that Meghan Markle, in the eyes of the crown, was no longer part of the institution she once married into. Now here's the dramatic irony. At the same time this quiet royal annihilation was underway, Meghan was on a call with her Netflix team, discussing a new documentary concept based on her journey as a global humanitarian silenced by tradition. You can't make this stuff up. Except we can, in this dramatized expose. Meghan's production partner allegedly floated a title idea, Reborn, unaware that, on the other side of the Atlantic, King Charles was metaphorically burying her. But even as the royal decree was being drafted, something shifted. Charles's anger turned into something darker. Resentment. Not just toward Meghan, but toward Harry. Because while Meghan was unleashing lawyers and prepping storylines, Harry was silent. No public defense of the monarchy. No distancing from his wife's legal strategy. No quiet message to his father or brother to de-escalate. He had disappeared, and Charles saw it as betrayal. Again, Camilla, who had long warned Charles that Harry had exiled himself emotionally long before he left physically, reportedly told him, "You're protecting someone who already chose a side." That's when the king issued what insiders called the final order. Not just revocation, but a palace-wide freeze on all Sussex-related archives, mentions, and affiliations. Web editors were told to archive pages quietly. Charity liaisons were instructed to prepare severance letters. Staff were told not to comment, internally or externally. Meghan wasn't just being removed. She was being erased, institutionally. And yet, even in that moment of full fury, Charles knew this wasn't over. Because Meghan's team wasn't backing down. They had already begun shopping a new podcast, allegedly titled Uncrowned, focused entirely on the modern woman's rejection of hierarchical silence. The press would eat it up, and worse, it would paint Charles's move as exactly what Meghan claimed, punishment for independence. That's when the palace pivoted. The king's lawyers advised him to make the revocation legal, but not public. At least not yet. They needed a trigger, a moment, a story. A scandal big enough to bury Meghan's inevitable counter-narrative. And that's when they found it. Inside the dossier, in the appendix, a line buried deep in an email chain. A connection no one had flagged yet. Because it wasn't just Meghan who had attended the Epstein-affiliated party in question. It was someone else. A name even more powerful, even more dangerous. And suddenly, the palace wasn't dealing with just a duchess. They were dealing with a potential state scandal. Because what came next didn't just threaten Meghan's royal status. It threatened to blow open every sealed file, every redacted name, and every royal cover-up from the last 25 years. And Meghan? She wasn't the only one who knew. What do monarchies do when their foundations begin to crack? They retreat. They whisper. They call emergency meetings, not in press rooms, but behind centuries-old doors where even history has secrets. And in this chapter, we step into one such room. Because after the fury, after the files, after the photo, came the moment the royal family realized this wasn't just a scandal. This was a ticking reputational time bomb. The setting? Buckingham Palace. Thursday, 7:42 p.m. Storms outside. Storms inside. Summoned quietly and without aids. King Charles, Queen Camilla, Prince William, Princess Anne, Royal Secretary Sir Edward Travers, Intelligence Liaison Officer, unnamed, Legal Counsel, Special Envoy. Phones were confiscated, curtains drawn. Even senior palace staff were barred. This wasn't a routine crisis talk. It was something more dangerous. A meeting where the stakes weren't headlines. They were survival. Because as the king's intelligence officer placed the newest document on the polished oak table, silence fell across the room. This file wasn't about Meghan alone. It was about who else was in that same social cluster, and whose name had just surfaced in a never-before-revealed deposition filed as part of the ongoing Epstein fallout. The name? An aristocrat, a friend of the firm, and, more dangerously, a former cabinet member with deep access to royal functions, foreign policy channels, and classified briefings. Let's call him Lord X for now. Lord X had hosted Meghan and Prince Harry for a private dinner in 2018. Photos from that night had been splashed across the tabloids. Glowing headlines, curated smiles, charity buzzwords. But what hadn't been shown? That Lord X had also been a longtime guest of Epstein's Manhattan townhouse and was now under renewed investigation by U.S. authorities after a former housekeeper placed him at the scene more than once. And guess what? Meghan had reportedly kept in touch with him, even after stepping back from royal duties. Emails, invitations, friendly notes. Now pause. What does this mean for the palace? It means Meghan wasn't the scandal anymore. She was the thread, the one that, if pulled too hard, could unravel connections they'd buried. Connections that might point to how deeply entangled British aristocracy really was in the Epstein network. This was no longer about one duchess. It was about the system, which is why, according to fictional insiders in our exposé narrative, Princess Anne was the first to speak. And what she said shocked even Charles. She has to be cut, not just from titles, from narrative, from memory. Let that sink in. And, loyal, iron-willed, duty-bound, had just recommended Meghan's full erasure from public royal discourse. Not just legal removal, historical removal. But William disagreed. He leaned forward, visibly agitated, and snapped. That will make her louder. She feeds on the victim script. If we erase her, she becomes the story. He wasn't wrong. Because by this point, Meghan's team had already begun laying the foundation for a multi-platform counterattack. Leaked hints suggested a new documentary was in development. A book proposal was circulating with the title, The Crown's Darkest Mirror. And worst of all, a former royal aide had reportedly agreed to an off-the-record interview, flipping sides. So now the palace was facing a dilemma. Option 1. Go nuclear. Strip Meghan's status entirely. Deny, dismiss, erase. Option 2. Maintain controlled distance. Quietly sever ties, offer no public comment, and hope the narrative burns out before public opinion turns. But then the legal envoy at the table delivered the curveball. According to new leaks, a U.S. journalist had acquired the subdirectory from the Black Book, the very document tying Meghan indirectly to individuals close to Epstein's financial layer. And worse, that journalist had already contacted 2 major UK outlets for a syndication deal. In less than a week, it would go public. That meant the palace had no time, no leverage, no negotiation, only damage control. Camilla reportedly asked the legal team, if we act now, revoke her status, and sever ties before the article drops, do we inoculate the crown? To which the response was, not entirely, but we create a line, a before and after. We show that the crown acts when ethics are breached, even by family. That settled it. The room agreed mostly, all except William, whose jaw clenched as he stared at the photo of Meghan with Lord X. She dragged Harry into this, he whispered. He's either a pawn, or worse. But either way, he's not innocent anymore. Charles didn't respond. He couldn't, because part of him still hoped, against all evidence, that his youngest son would pick up the phone, say something, deny, distance, apologize. But Harry remained silent. So the king gave the order. Draft the letter. Strip the styling. Prepare the announcement. We act before the fire reaches the gates. And that was that. The palace machine shifted into full crisis mode. But outside that room, the press didn't know. The public didn't know. Not yet. Because while the royal family scrambled to protect itself, Meghan was preparing a very different message, one that didn't just counter their silence. It exposed their hypocrisy. And just as the palace prepared to strike first, Meghan did the unthinkable. She released something even more dangerous than a statement. She released a voice, a witness, from inside the Epstein orbit, claiming they'd seen everything. And that Meghan wasn't just a guest, she was introduced. They thought she'd go quietly. They thought the mounting pressure, the whisper campaigns, the sealed files, the looming royal exile would force her into silence. But they forgot one thing. Meghan Markle has always been a fighter, not with fists, but with lawyers, microphones, and strategy. And this time, she came prepared. Let's set the scene. News had begun to leak. Whispers of a potential palace statement, documents under review, Meghan's name reappearing in controversial records. The blogosphere buzzed. Royal watchers posted cryptic tweets. Talk shows teased unnamed bombshells. And then nothing. Silence. The kind that feels more ominous than noise. But inside Archewell HQ, Meghan wasn't staying still. According to fictional insiders in this dramatized exposé, her Montecito team went into full lockdown. Phones off. Rooms secured. Crisis teams mobilized. This wasn't just about optics anymore. It was about survival, brand, reputation, identity. And at the center of the war room, a 38-page legal response labeled Royal Malice Briefing, version 4. Because yes, Meghan knew what was coming. And yes, she was planning a counteroffensive. But what no one expected was what she released first. Not a podcast, not a tweet, not a press statement. A witness. The palace had the Black Book. Meghan had a voice. She didn't put her face forward. She didn't even name her. But in the first few minutes of her surprise podcast upload, titled Unfiltered, The Rooms I Walked Through, a distorted voice emerged. Feminine. Calm. Chilling. I remember her. Not as a celebrity. Not as a duchess. Just as a woman who wanted access. Who asked the right questions. Who was introduced to the wrong people. Pause. Now imagine hearing that with no context. It sounds like a confession. But then, the twist. Because the voice doesn't accuse Meghan of wrongdoing. In fact, she defends her. She didn't know what these men were. She thought they were just rich. She thought they were connected. She thought they could help. And just like that, the narrative flipped. Meghan went from implied conspirator to alleged victim of elite grooming networks. Brilliant, dangerous, and entirely unprovable. Within 12 hours, the podcast clip trended globally. Hashtag she was there. Hashtag but did she know? Hashtag royal cover-up. And while critics accused Meghan of playing the victim again, her legal team made their real move. They filed a preemptive injunction against any defamatory association, direct or implied, between the Duchess of Sussex and ongoing criminal investigations involving Jeffrey Epstein or known affiliates. But that wasn't all. They also issued a cease and desist to multiple UK publications, warning that any attempt to publish unverified names tied to Meghan in Epstein's orbit would result in a coordinated international defamation suit. The language was brutal. Words like fabricated, malicious, weaponized innuendo, abuse of journalistic privilege. And behind the scenes, they were already preparing a civil countersuit strategy if the palace dared to publicly move forward with a revocation announcement. That was the checkmate. Because the monarchy didn't operate well in lawsuits. It operated in protocol, in tradition, in controlled leaks and deniable whispers. But now, Meghan had dragged them into the one place they feared most, the open battlefield of international litigation. And that battlefield favors her. Because in court, things can be subpoenaed. Emails, flight logs, guest lists, photos, internal memos, the very documents the palace had tried to contain. In our fictional universe, this threat shocked the palace's legal team. Charles, who had hoped for a clean break, now faced the possibility of Meghan weaponizing the palace's own knowledge, not just to clear her name, but to expose who else knew what and when. Meanwhile, Meghan's attorneys doubled down on their framing. They didn't deny she'd been at events with billionaires. They reframed it. Our client, like many women in the industry, was exposed to powerful circles she didn't fully understand. She was young, ambitious, and trusting. Attempts to frame her as complicit are not only false, they are misogynistic, classist, and defamatory. Boom. The keywords flew. Misogyny, elitism, exploitation, institutional gaslighting. Words that play very well on social media. By the time Meghan's attorneys appeared on Good Morning America in a pre-recorded interview, they weren't just defending her. They were going on offense. Why is it that every time a woman in power challenges tradition, the establishment circles back to scandal by association? Where is the same scrutiny for the men in these books? That's the pivot. Suddenly, Meghan wasn't the problem. She was the whistleblower's ally. Her podcast team edited a second episode, this time with testimony from a former celebrity assistant who claimed to have warned Meghan about certain men but was overruled by her publicist. Again, no direct accusation, but just enough intrigue to create doubt. And in the public square, doubt is often more powerful than denial. Meanwhile, Archewell's PR arm launched a subtle campaign under the radar. Anonymous tweets, blind gossip tips, quiet re-edits to old blog content. Even new SEO-optimized articles recontextualizing Meghan's early years. Suddenly, old photos were missing. Archived web pages vanished. Social bios were updated. It was a digital cleansing. While the monarchy deliberated titles, Meghan deleted data. But then, just when the momentum seemed to shift in her favor, it happened. A leak from inside her own camp. A former stylist, fired last year over alleged contract disputes, emailed select journalists with a copy of an internal Archewell timeline, a planning document from early 2023. And one line in that document: prepare contingency assets in case of Epstein resurgence. Reposition Duchess narrative as outsider/victim. Let that sit. Because even if not damning, it was revealing. It showed intent, strategy, anticipation. Suddenly, Meghan's victim narrative looked curated. The palace pounced. Behind the scenes, Charles's senior counsel reportedly said, "This confirms what we suspected. They're not reacting. They're orchestrating." And just like that, Meghan's momentum stalled. Because now she wasn't just fighting insinuation. She was battling the perception of calculated emotional manipulation. Public sentiment splintered. Hashtags turned from hashtag justice for Meghan to hashtag Meghan knew. Pundits flipped. Podcasts debated. Royalists re-emerged. And just as the chaos peaked, another blow landed. Not from the monarchy, not from Meghan, but from the FBI. Because quietly, without fanfare, a sealed witness list from a 2011 deposition was partially unsealed. And on page 17, one name stood out. Not Meghan Markle, but someone closer. Closer than anyone imagined. The Black Book. Two words that still make institutions sweat. Let me ask you something right now. Have you ever seen a document that didn't just record history, but weaponized it? That didn't just contain names, but detonated reputations? That's this book. Once dismissed as a rumor index and rich man Rolodex, Epstein's infamous little black contact directory became a symbol of